Here we go. Now, our topic for today, a bit different. Okay. So, before we dive in, a few points of sort of disclaimers or introductory remarks. I mentioned last week that the shift is now, or the sort of the focus of the course is now shifting from me standing in front of you and lecturing or trying to get you interested at some point, to you all starting to engage with these issues actively. And that's what we're going to do today, please. So, as I was saying, yeah, so the point is to get you all engaged in this topic, but in order to do that, that means we're sort of going to have to examine case studies and look at possible applications of these technologies. And here's the disclaimer, the warning sort of point. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about applications of AI systems in different domains, and we're going to be touching on really delicate topics. Topics related to death, topics related to suicide, topics related to racism, perhaps domestic violence, and so on and so forth. Now, a lot of you might have personal opinions about these issues and very strong convictions about these issues, and that's excellent and fine. What I'm going to ask you to do is try and box those thoughts and opinions and convictions away just for the hour and a half that we're here together, and try and approach these issues less substantively, but rather as a way for us to engage with the arguments behind it. So even if this is a topic that you feel very strongly about, try and set those issues aside. We're going to engage with this theoretically, okay? So I hope that warning will be clear enough to everyone. And I mentioned in the very first class that sort of there are no wrong answers in this classroom, right? And that's true because we're interested in your intuitions about issues. But there are disrespectful answers. So I'm going to ask you all to just be a bit careful when we touch on these issues and sort of show respect to the people around you as you start engaging on these topics. We don't want anyone's feelings to get hurt, and we don't want anyone to feel that they are being sort of disrespected in this class, okay? So that's really important. And if you feel that something was uncomfortable for you, please come to me later and tell me, and we'll try and make that a bit better, all right? So that was sort of the disclaimer. It's very important for me that everyone feels very comfortable here, okay? And so our topic for today is warfare. And this is, of course, one of those very thorny issues that many of you perhaps have strong opinions about, and that can be quite difficult from a moral standpoint, from an ethical standpoint, from a political standpoint. And so we're going to delve right into that. Now, before we do that, I asked you all to watch a video in preparation for this class. Hopefully you've all had an opportunity to do that. And let's hear some impressions from what you thought about the content there. Let's hear maybe 2 or 3 examples about what you thought. Right. Yeah, so it's create even a larger disparity between those who have the technology and those who don't, between the rich and the poor and so on. Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, great. Thank you all for the impressions. I hope it sort of gave you an overview about the topic, and that sort of saves me from really delving into these technologies. And I can't explain it as well as the New York Times can, and I can't edit myself so beautifully like that. So I think it's just more effective if you guys just watch that. Okay, but hopefully that gave you some ideas about what's going on in this field, what are the types of developments that are happening. And as I mentioned, again, we're going to shift the focus to you guys, and sort of the structure, the format that we're going to do from now on is we're going to start each class with me sort of talking a bit about the topic, introducing us to it, examining together one case study, and then we're going to do teamwork. We're going to split you up into groups, and each group will have a specific topic they're going to be focusing on for 15, 20 minutes, and then when we come back to the main group, to the general class, as I keep talking about those issues, each group will have a chance to sort of give their input on that topic. Okay? But I'll explain about that in a minute. So let's dive straight in. What are we going to be doing today? We're talking about warfare, so we're going to be focusing on 3 issues. Well, actually 2 issues really, but I'll explain that in a second. First of all, as always, we're going to talk about the uses of AI in warfare. So an overview, you guys have seen the video, so this is going to be very short. But in that, we're going to talk about our first case study, and we're going to look at that. After that, we're going to look at the ethics of lethal autonomous weapon systems, right? These laws, as they're called. And that's going to be the main focus of today, this second part. I don't think we're going to have time to get through all of it, but if we do, there's also a third part, which is about this notion of meaningful human control. Probably if you guys did some reading about this topic, this notion came up several times. What exactly does that mean? How do we use that? Okay. But again, I doubt we'll have time to get that. There's just a bit too much on this topic, but we'll see. Maybe we'll be very quick. Let's dive straight in. The uses of AI in warfare. So the video went through everything. I'm just going to do a really, really quick rundown, okay? And first of all, we can see that the use is split up into various different domains. I'm just going to focus on 3 of them here. The first of them is defensive weapon systems, right? We can use this technology for defensive purposes. And some of them can be very laudable and something that we don't find very problematic. For instance, underwater mine detectors. Perhaps that doesn't raise a lot of ethical questions or problematic issues. Defensive systems that shoot down rockets. This is a picture of the Iron Dome in Israel and how it's an anti-missile weapon, right? It shoots down these short-range missiles coming from either Lebanon or from Gaza, and this is how Israel protects itself. And this has been deployed also in other countries. It's been exported. And up here we have a sort of a perimeter turret tower. So this is actually, this specific system is not autonomous, it's joystick controlled, but what would happen is you would use this system on the border, and someone would be sitting in some kind of bunker far away, holding a joystick, and they would be controlling it with all these monitors, and they could see what's going on, and then from a distance use this to fire on anyone coming close. But this can also be converted to fully autonomous mode, in which the system on its own detects incoming enemies and opens fire on them. Okay? For instance, these systems were deployed in the North-South Korea border. They're using these types of autonomous weapon systems, right? All right, so those are defensive systems. And then we have the opposite side. We have offensive weapon systems, right? These systems are built and designed for offense, for attacking, for killing, for destroying. So we have here loitering munitions that the video talked about a lot, I think. These suicide drones, what are called. These are sort of systems that hang up in the air and they can stay around for a few hours seeking a target. And when they identify a target that fits their predetermined parameters, they just dive bomb onto that target. We have controlled automobile vehicles. This is a D9. This is used to flatten buildings, remove cars, and it can be used also from a distance or autonomously. And here we have these rifle systems. So this is specifically built onto like this tripod, but this can also be handheld by an infantry soldier, and then the system would lock on to an enemy and give a jolt to indicate that it is locked on the target, and then when the soldier fires, it aims and shoots and ensures that the infantry soldier hits the target. So it's to improve accuracy, to allow you to engage with fast-moving systems like drones that are coming in and so forth. Okay, these are offensive weapon systems. And you've seen the video, it's explained all about that, so no need to go really into the details of this. Although these will be the focus in the next section when we talk about the ethics, right, of these systems. But before we do that, I want to take our first case study, and we're going to think about this together. And this is about a third type of use of AI systems, a decision support system. Now, we're not going to be touching much on these after this case study, so we're going to deal with that now together. And why is this a bit less interesting than later? Well, because decision support systems are sort of, they go on the line between an automated system and an autonomous system. So it has certain autonomous capabilities, deep learning, machine learning types of capabilities, but it doesn't act in the world, right? These systems do not engage and fire on targets. They provide recommendations. They allow for us to curate data. So they provide support. Nevertheless, these are also raising a lot of ethical questions, and I brought for us 2 examples of these decision support systems that are currently being used and that I find quite interesting or challenging from an ethical and theoretical perspective. Now, again, a disclaimer, we don't know a lot about these systems. This is classified. No one is revealing exactly what's going on. If you think ChatGPT's data is hidden, try and understand these military systems and how much. Okay, so we don't really know what's going on, but we can make assumptions, right? And we can make guesses as to what can go wrong with these systems. And this is what we're going to try to do. We're going to focus on 2 of these systems today. The upper system is an article that I sent out to all of you. This is about the Habsora system, right? And this is the system developed by the Israeli Defense Forces for creating targets for attacking, okay? It's a automated targeting system that generates targets, a military target bank. So it doesn't attack and it doesn't target actual combatants. It just provides recommendations of what should be attacked. And then we have the Maven project down below, which was a bit more spoken about. This was a project first developed by the US Army and Google, and then there was a big protest within Google that they didn't want to take part of developing weapon systems. A lot of the employees in Google protested this, and Google sort of stepped back from the project, and in came Palantir, another defense contracting company, and they took over this project. And Project Maven is again being developed by the US Army and is being deployed as targeting systems. So again, it provides recommendations, but a step further, it provides real-time actual recommendations on a screen for a commander to use, in which it indicates for that commander eligible targets, ineligible targets, and now let's look at some of the details of these systems. So I brought a few quotes for us to go over, and again, this is just to sort of spring our mind and bring up these ideas of what can go wrong and what is problematic with these systems. And once we move to the next part of the class, we'll start analyzing these. So let's read first together. Intelligence sources who served in the previous operations also told Plus 972, that's the magazine that wrote this article, and Local Call, that for 10 days in 2021 and 3 weeks in 2014, an attack rate of 100 to 200 targets per day led to a situation in which the Israeli Air Force had no targets of military value. So in previous engagements, attacking 100 to 200 targets led very quickly that the military could not find eligible targets for attack. They ran out of targets that they want to attack. Now remember, most operations by armies are calculated, they're not random, they're not sporadic, usually at least, right? There are cases. Usually what happens is that there's a procedure for which target you're going to engage, and it's not just that the jet pilot is flying in the air and seeking a target of opportunity, right? That doesn't happen today as much, or as frequently, especially in these kinds of attacks. So they have a target bank, and then they choose one of these targets and they send an attack onto it. And we see in the past engagements, 100 to 200 targets per day, very quickly. There were no more targets to attack. Okay, and now let's go on to what's happening today in the current Gaza-Israeli war. Something has changed, right? Months after this engagement or this war has begun, Israel is still finding targets to attack. And how is that? And this has to do with this AI system. And let's see what they say to us. They say, the answer may lie in a statement, blah, blah, blah. Okay. According to intelligence sources, Habsorah, that's the name of the system, generates, among other things, automatic recommendations for attacking private residences where people suspected of being Hamas or Islamic Jihad operatives live. So it takes all the data that the intelligence services has, satellite imagery, CCTV, sources, whatever you can think of, telephone tracking systems, GPS, and so on and so forth. It curates all that data and provides targets for the military to approach. Habsorah, Habsorah, explained one of the sources, processes enormous amounts of data that tens of thousands of intelligence officers could not process. So it brings it up to scale, right? It scales this process and then recommends bombing sites in real time. A human eye will go over the targets before each attack, but it need not spend a lot of time on them. The process is quick. Okay? There's still a human in the loop, as we like to say. A human is involved in looking over every single target, but it goes very, very quickly. They don't spend days or hours analyzing the data, looking where the target is, rechecking everything, reconfiguring the system. No. The system will spit something else, and very, very quickly it will go through the chain and be sent out for an operation. The result was that in Operation Guardian of the Walls in 2021, from the moment this machine was activated, that's when this machine was first developed. Then it was tested, now it's being fully deployed. The machine generated 100 new targets every single day. You see, in the past, there were times in Gaza when we would create 50 targets per year. Look at the difference. If this was done by hand, by the regular procedure, they could create at times maybe 50 good, legitimate targets per year. Now the system was creating 100 targets per day. And here the machine produces 100 targets in one day. A senior military official in charge of the target bank told the Jerusalem Post earlier this year that thanks to the Army's AI system, for the first time, the military can generate new targets at a faster rate than it attacks. You never run out of targets. The system keeps generating more and more targets. Now, what does that mean? Are these good targets, bad targets? That might be a problem, right? Is there such a thing as an infinite amount of targets? You're cutting corners somewhere. Or perhaps not. That's what they're claiming. They're claiming that no corners are being cut, that the same process has just been automated. And it's just manpower, right? We've brought this up to scale. Okay. Automated systems like Upsala have thus greatly facilitated the work of Israeli intelligence officers in making decisions during military operations, including calculating potential casualties. 5 different sources confirm that the number of civilians who may be killed in attacks on private residences is known in advance to Israeli intelligence and appears clearly in the target file under the category of collateral damage. So each single attack comes with a tagline, collateral damage X. Now in the article they go on to explain that then the chain of command, how it works is they get sort of, you are eligible to attack collateral damage 3. Collateral damage 5, whatever. The order comes down, and then if that's the collateral damage that is approved, they can use all those that are tagged with that amount of collateral damage, they become eligible targets. And then the bank gives out those targets. Now, can they truly assess real-time information in such a densely populated area? Specifically, if we're talking about Gaza, this seems to me incredible, right? This is really, really an area where it's the most vulnerable area of this type of system, right? Obviously, this is going to be a huge challenge. How do you continuously produce real-time information when it's going through a system? No one's looking at it. This would be a warning flag for me, right? Very suspicious. Okay, turning now to the Maven project. The Maven project US developed. Let's see what they say. The Maven platform has advanced significantly since its early days, right? It was developed around, I think, 2018. It really started working in the military, and then let's see what happens. In addition to video imagery, it can now incorporate data from radar systems that see through clouds, darkness, and rain, as well as from heat-detecting infrared sensors, allowing it to look for objects of interest, such as engines or weapons factories. It can also analyze non-visual information by cross-referencing geolocation tags from electronic surveillance and social media feeds, for example. Social media feeds, internet access, infrared, these are really, really advanced technological ways for us to sort of try and produce real-time information to create accuracy. Again, very vulnerable. You can imagine really quickly how these things can change. And once this system is automated, is there really that point where we can say, stop? Maybe, maybe not. Let's see. The technology has helped enable computers to occupy 4 of the 6 places in the decision-making loop. What are these places? Software determines what data to gather, collates and analyzes the resulting information, and communicates a commander's decision to act. So what's left for the commander is to make the decision and to fire the weapon. Everything else is done by the system. So these 2 sort of fail-safe are meant to ensure sort of that a human remains in the loop, that a human is taking responsibility for these attacks, and so on and so forth. And we'll get to those issues soon. Finally, Temple, the person being interviewed, estimates that with Maven's assistance, he can now sign off on as many as 80 targets in an hour of work, versus 30 targets without it. So the leap has gone from 30 to 80. And now look how he describes it. He describes the process of concurring with the algorithm conclusion in a rapid staccato. Accept, accept, accept. Trusting the computer entirely would be even faster. But Temple says that would introduce errors. I don't even want to get caught short, he says. We get caught short, we're screwed. So to Temple's mind, this going from 30 to 80 is safe enough because the system is secure enough, and this accept, accept, accept is reliable enough that he won't get screwed. Okay, so we're seeing how these systems are used. Now let's try and think, what are some of those thoughts that come up to your minds now that you've sort of heard about these decision-making systems? Well, what comes to your mind? Where are the weaknesses? What might be problems in these systems? Yes, please. All right, let's now start diving in. And so, because we want to split up into the groups as quick as possible. So let me go through this first part, and then we'll split into the groups and we'll start examining these issues. So we're going to talk about the ethics of lethal autonomous weapon systems laws, and let's see a definition that was offered for this type of system. So, a weapon system that once activated can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator. This is sort of a very high level for understanding what is autonomous capabilities here. No human intervention necessary. Once it is activated, it can go on its own. This includes human-supervised autonomous weapon systems that are designed to allow human operators to override operation of the weapon system, but can select and engage targets without further human input after activation. So even if you have sort of an abort button, it would still fall under this category of an autonomous weapon. Okay, so this is sort of what we're working on. And now the question is, why do we want to use these systems? So why do we think this is a good idea? Some of you wrote questions like, well, you know, when we're thinking about the ethics of war, we should be not thinking about how to develop these systems, right? We should be thinking about more, why are we even dealing with wars? What's the ethics behind that, yeah? So this is an important question that's going on behind. So why are we incentivized, or what is the motivation behind it? Well, there are a lot of good reasons why we would want to develop these systems. And one of them, for instance, is reduced manpower, right? You saw in the video they talked about taking an operation that needed 30 people, can be conducted by one person. So reduced manpower means as a country we don't need to invest as much in our military. We can spend that on education, on healthcare, and so on and so forth. Machine-to-machine interaction. We might think that the problem often is when there is a human in the way, actually, right? Because a human doesn't interact at the same pace or with the same capabilities as a machine. So machine-to-machine interaction is way more efficient. Perhaps not as safe, perhaps not as responsible, but is way more efficient. Human fallibility. Humans make mistakes all the time. We want to try and eliminate that. This is sort of the motto behind all types of AI systems, right? Get rid of the human. We are bad at making decisions. We talked about all that last week. Okay, quicker response time. Imagine a jet plane firing a rocket. I don't know how fast they go, 1,000 kilometers per second. I don't know, I probably made that up. No human can react to that speed. Nevertheless, sensors and AI-based technology can respond in time. So it gives us a lot more opportunity to defend ourselves if we need. Analyzing vast amounts of data. Assuming we know what is the right data to analyze, a system can do that way, way, way better and quicker than a human. We saw. What was the example they gave? 10,000 hours or 10,000 people working on this are the equivalent of what this system does. Fatigue. Almost fatigue, but people get tired, right? People need to sleep. People need tents. They need food. They need bubble baths. Humans are hard to maintain, right? We demand maintenance. Machines do also, but perhaps at an easier way to handle. Okay, safer for soldiers. This is one of the biggest arguments, right? And we'll talk about that in a minute in more depth, but we have the obligation to make sure that our soldiers are safe. And if these systems can ensure that our soldiers do not put themselves in harm's way, then we have a huge, huge reason and incentive to develop these systems. And finally, more ethical. And I put question mark because obviously that's our topic and we want to understand, is this true? Now let me try and make the case for why I think there is some grounds to agree with this, right? We know of the past and we know that humans have done really terrible things. Right? Here are some images from the Second World War. This is a case of shaving the heads of women who collaborated with the Nazis in the Netherlands. This was after they were liberated, this was the response. They were gathered in the town square, shaved their head, and they had to walk down the street bleeding from the... Yeah. Here is an example of Nazi soldiers in Warsaw forcing Jews to dance in the street for their amusement. An AI system is very unlikely to do any of these things. These are human sort of motivations and desires to humiliate, to please our desires. These are issues that we can get rid of by employing these types of systems. All these atrocities that are not just harming people, but that go beyond that, that feed into the deranged minds of certain sociopaths, whatever. That is a human thing. And so we can get rid of that. Maybe the systems won't do these things. Or probably won't. We'll design them in such a way. Okay, now here's a general question that we need to take with us over for the next few weeks. How do we come to evaluate these systems? Well, the first issue we need to keep in mind is contingent versus essential properties. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when we come to design to analyze anything, we want to understand whether our analysis is focused on something that is essential to that object, or is it something that is just coincidental, contingent? If we look at Socrates here, let's look at an example of a contingent versus an essential property. So we might say Socrates is human. Essential or contingent? Essential, right? If Socrates was not human, it wouldn't be Socrates. Socrates is a philosopher. Well, that's contingent, right? Socrates could have been a baker. He could have been a football player, an Olympian. I don't know. So part of what being Socrates, well, maybe Socrates is a bad example because being a philosopher sort of, yeah, maybe it has become essential, but we understand the point. Human versus philosopher, okay? So when we come to analyze lethal autonomous weapon systems, we need to keep that in mind. What is an essential property and what is contingent? And our analysis will deeply depend on that. So for instance, the type of munition that the system uses, contingent or essential? Contingent, of course. The fact that it is non-human, contingent or essential? Essential, correct. The fact that it is based on an algorithmic decision-making procedure, contingent or essential? Essential. If it's not based on an algorithmic decision, it's not an AI system, it's something else. Training data, that it uses training data, contingent or essential? Well, it's essential that it's relying on training data, but it's contingent what data we gave it. And finally, navigation capabilities, that it can move around, contingent or essential? Contingent, of course. We have to keep these in mind when we're trying to address these systems. And when we're saying, oh, you know, that system is a bad system, it's problematic, is it problematic because of contingent reasons or essential ones? Okay, next issue we need to think of, we need to keep this in mind. What are our standards for evaluation? What are we comparing these systems to? So one idea is that we might compare it to humans as they are today. Well, that can be a bit of a problem because we know that war is dirty. We know that there are child soldiers being trained for war. We know that some cities are being carpet bombed by militaries, and we know that civilians are being executed in cold blood. So maybe comparing these systems to as humans are today is not the best standard for evaluation. I don't know. Perhaps instead we could compare to how people were in the past. Right? What did we do in the past? Well, again, quite problematic. This is an image of Julius Caesar on horseback at the head of his army fighting the Gauls. That's Caesar, okay, according to Midjourney. A famous event in the past, Julius Caesar fought the rebellion against the Gauls, and after he had starved one of their cities out, they surrendered, and as retribution, he collected all the men and cut off their arms, and then set them free as a sign, right, or as a way to remember not to rebel against Rome. Well, not very good standard for AI. What about this? When the Europeans arrived in the New World, right, they encountered the indigenous populations, and there are a lot of stories about them spreading diseases actively by giving blankets covered with smallpox and with different kinds of diseases in order to create biological weapons, right, against the indigenous populations. Again, I don't think we want AI systems to emulate that. And of course, this is inmates being liberated from Auschwitz. Okay, maybe. But again, an example that we would not want the systems to emulate. This is not the standard we want to evaluate it against. But perhaps if we can overcome that standard, maybe it's okay to use it. So again, humans today are bad. Humans in the past were bad. Perhaps we should evaluate it against as we would want them ideally to act. But then the question is, how do we want humans ideally to act in war? That's a complicated question. We went through that last week when we talked about the alignment problem. And when we have to give a real answer to these questions, it can become problematic. All right. Finally, for evaluating these systems, there is the Collingridge dilemma that we have to keep in mind. This is a dilemma from engineering, actually, that came. And what Collingridge wrote is that when change is easy, the need for it cannot be foreseen. But when the need for change is apparent, change has become expensive, difficult, and time-consuming. And this is sort of a dilemma that exists whenever we are dealing with responsible development of technology. Oftentimes, while we are creating the technology, we don't know the vulnerabilities of it. We can't know exactly how it will be used in a bad way. And once we find that out, it's already been implemented and it's difficult to change it or even impossible. One of the good examples that I always bring with this is how phones or cell phones created a huge amount of car accidents, right? People playing with their phones and then crashing. This wasn't really anticipated, and it took a long time until we adapted to that, legislatively, normatively, and so on and so forth. So whenever we're approaching these systems, we always have to think, what might be unexpected? Okay, so keep those three issues in mind, and now we're going for the real crux of the matter. When we're talking about lethal autonomous weapon systems, there are three main bodies of critiques, and we're going to be focusing on each of these three in groups. Each group will focus on one of these issues. The first is going to be on the anti-codifiability thesis, the second, the responsibility gaps, and the third, heartless killings and dehumanization. So now I'm going to split you up into three groups, and each group is going to get some scenarios to discuss and some questions. And I want you to try and answer these questions and be prepared later when we come back to talk about this to present sort of the group discussion. Let's see. Hopefully you had time to read the scenarios, let them run through your mind. We're going to go over them here together, and here as a group we might skip one of them just so that we can get through all the material. But let's dive in. The point with what we were talking about before, having these criteria of evaluation in our mind, in the back of our mind, now we're going to engage with these three types of objections, right? And we're going to start with the anti-codifiability thesis. So let's understand what that exactly means. So in order to do that, let's look at a short video that'll get us into this mood and see if that helps us understand. Okay. Anti-codifiability thesis. What would an autonomous system do in that situation? Would it be able to stop like Bradley Cooper there? To take that extra second? Is that a good thing to take that extra second? What if that kid had shot the missile? Very hard to decide. So the anti-codifiability thesis talks about the fact that our moral judgments cannot be codified and cannot be taught in a proper way to an artificial intelligence system. And here's some examples to sort of emphasize this idea. Here's a machine learning system that is taught to identify images. And here you see it has identified the school bus at 100%, one. But if we slightly change the image now, it thinks that it's now dealing with a garbage truck at 99%. And then again, if we change, now it thinks it's a punching bag at 100%. And now it thinks it's a snowplow at 92%. So it changes its mind quite quickly depending on the angle it sees. Let's see a few more examples. Motor scooter, parachute, bobsled, parachute again. A fire truck, a school bus, a fire boat, and a bobsled. Change the angle, present to it something it hasn't seen in the data set, it thinks it's seeing something completely different. Remember we talked about it. It becomes invisible, it becomes blind sometimes. It doesn't see what it hasn't learned yet. And the anti-codifiability thesis says essentially that it's the same problem. The codifiability thesis is the claim that the true moral theory could be captured in universal rules, that we can capture it. And the anti-codifiability thesis is the exact opposite, right? Unless the true moral theory is codifiable, artificial intelligence can never be trusted to make sound moral decisions. That is the claim, and that is the objection. Yes?
What does codifiable mean?
That you can turn it into code.
Oh.
Now, one such example, we can look at Asimov's laws of robotics. Right? For those familiar, these are classic 3 laws of how robots should be designed and acted, right? And the 3 laws talk about that a robot may not injure a human through inaction, that a robot must obey orders given to it, and that a robot must protect its own existence. And the idea is that these 3 laws are completely coherent, can be easily codified, right? And can address every single situation. Well, that's not so simple as maybe Asimov wanted us to believe when it comes to tricky situations. Let's try and think about the rules of war. And which group had this topic? This group here. Okay, so now I'll need your help in a second. The Yusin Bello talks about the rules of engagement, the rules of war, the principles of conduct within a war. And when we talk about these, we find 3 main principles in international humanitarian law, in human rights documents, in the Geneva Conventions, and so on. We talk about the principle of discrimination, the ability to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, to discriminate between them. Proportionality and necessity, the idea that each engagement must be proportionate to its achievement. And finally, responsibility. So these are the 3 principles that can be derived from international humanitarian law. And let's see if we could codify these principles, or what are the problems with that. So we want to be able to distinguish between a soldier and a non-soldier, a combatant and a non-combatant. But oftentimes, these situations can be tricky or vague. Here we see a picture of a boy holding a ceremonial knife known as a kirpan. Okay? A child carrying a kirpan. And a kirpan is a knife, eventually. And now we need to ask ourselves, a system that sees a person with a weapon might identify this as a combatant. We need to find a way that the system knows that this is not a combatant in this case, right? So let's talk about the first scenario that we dealt with. Now, the first scenario talks about an encounter in which a group of soldiers is about to enter a house, and inside the house there are kids playing with a ball, and they're running around. The soldiers think that there are insurgents inside that they are about to either take out or arrest or capture, and yet there aren't any inside. The soldiers enter, the boys running around with the kirpan are running after a ball. The parents notice something's wrong and they scream, "Stop, stop, get away from the door!" The soldiers need to identify, is this a dangerous situation? Are we dealing with combatants? Do we open fire? And the question is, what conditions would we need for a system to be able to identify that this is a harmless situation? What came up in your discussion? Yeah, that's interesting. Another few examples in this scenario were, would a system, for instance, this is the prompt, terrorist wearing white clothing, holding a weapon in the air as if celebrating. And what I wanted to capture here is this idea of someone trying to surrender, right? So where it's unclear, is he celebrating, is he raising his hands to surrender? The system would have to distinguish between those 2 situations, because they might make the difference between a combatant and a non-combatant. Yes? Example that I put here, a scary soldier with a broomstick instead of a weapon. This is actually a guy just sweeping the street, but I mean, he looks really scary. Maybe the system would tag this as a combatant. Again, tricky situations. Other more realistic maybe scenarios, a child with a weapon, combatant, non-combatant, legitimate target, illegitimate target. How about a group of kids sitting on a tank in the middle of a war zone? Bomb the tank, don't bomb the tank, right? All these issues would be part of this discrimination, and the anti-codifiability thesis claims that essentially we won't be able to distinguish between these scenarios. We won't be able to teach the system to meet all these really, really delicate scenarios and situations. Now if we talk about proportionality and necessity, so let's just skip this. This is the description in law. What is this proportionality? But the scenario that we looked at here was a collateral damage scenario, right? So I think, what was it in the end? Was it the bomb shelter or not? Isn't for the collateral damage? Okay, basically the question is, if how much is a legitimate amount of collateral damage? And can a system sort of be able to compute that idea? 3 people okay, 5 people not okay? I don't know. Difficult to decide. Maybe 1 or 2 just points about this scenario that came up. So here are a few examples, right, that I brought. A terrorist situation, if you have to kill a high-profile terrorist, if it's next to a school, do you bomb it or not? Right? These are sort of debates that we have to go. We're seeing now in the 2 ongoing conflicts in the Ukraine and in Gaza, we're seeing that the death tolls are tremendous. In the Ukraine, we're talking about 10,000 civilians estimated have died, a way higher number of soldiers. And in the Gaza conflict, we're seeing the war there, we're seeing 30,000 claimed deaths, where half of them are women and children, estimated by Hamas authorities and by the UN. So we're seeing devastating deaths of civilians. And this sort of partially with the use of AI, but mostly without, right? But will the AI system be able to improve this type of behavior? What we would need to do in order to codify these laws of war, these rules of engagement, we would have to be able to distinguish perfectly between combatants and non-combatants. We would have to be able to determine what is excessive damage. What does that mean? We would have to be able to say that what is the advantage that is anticipated from that attack? Is that worth the killing of lives? Are these the types of decisions that a system can make? Is there a right answer to these questions? So the anti-codifiability thesis says, again, that no, and it says it for 3 basic ideas, right? It would say that what we need is some kind of moral agency. We need a human moral agent in order to determine these issues, and it is done on the basis of what's known as phronesis, right? This idea of virtue, wisdom, that there is no written answer to these questions. We have to debate them, we have to engage with them, and by knowing what is morality and what is a good life, we find the answer to these questions. And finally, there's this issue of incommensurability. And this I won't go into, although I wanted to, and this is the idea that oftentimes we lack measurements for certain aspects. What is the right amount of collateral damage? Can we compare military advantage versus harm to civilians? And if we do compare, what unit do we use to make that evaluation? Is 1 life worth a 10% advantage? I don't know. Is 2 lives worth a radar installation? Is there some kind of metric that we can use? Well, systems that are mathematical systems would have to sort of overcome this problem. I'm going to skip it. And the question is this decisive? Is this anti-codifiability objection a decisive objection to the use of laws? And here's some problems with it. Well, we know that humans aren't moral either, right? So, I mean, if we can just make the tiniest improvement over what is existing now, maybe it's worth it. Humans anyway do all these mistakes. Let's get close enough. What about an envelopment strategy? This is often proposed. Let's use these systems only in very clean scenarios. You know, bombing in a desert where there are no civilians around. Maybe that way we can use it. Maybe it's legitimate then. So I would say that on its own, the anti-codifiability thesis is not a decisive objection. I think it has holes in it. It is a strong objection, but there's a lot of room to debate. And most of this room to debate is because a lot of these are contingent factors. Maybe the system will be good enough. Maybe we can codify it, right? Maybe in 10 years we'll have the technology for it. All right, let's move on to the second group. We'll talk about responsibility gaps. Now, in order to talk about responsibility gaps, first we have to talk about responsibility, right? So, what is responsibility? So we need to distinguish between legal and moral responsibility. Where's the group that dealt with this? You guys. Did this distinction come up between legal and moral responsibility? And what did, maybe give 1 or 2 an example. A child drowning in a shallow pond, a bystander passes by. Well, there's no bystander here, but I wanted to recreate the scenario, a famous philosophical dilemma. You're walking in the wood and you see a child drowning. Do you save the child? at the price of making your new shoes wet? That's sort of the question that's asked. And of course, the obvious answer is yes, you save the child, right? I mean, if someone says no, there's some kind of problem there. But the point of this example, right, is that for our sakes, I don't know if legally you're obliged to do that. I mean, there are some places where there's aid laws, right, where you're required to assist. But in some places that's not. Morally speaking, we would say it's reprehensible if you allowed a child to drown in a pond that is 10 centimeters deep. Completely unacceptable. What about a soldier sees a child, the child is holding a cell phone, right? The scenario from the video. Again, legally speaking, I don't know. Is it okay to kill? Maybe yes. Morally speaking, and again, this is the prompt, this is what I got from the prompt. So legal responsibility, we would often say that it's arbitrary, right? Whatever the law says, that's the legality of it, right? Good, bad, irrelevant. Moral responsibility has nothing to do with arbitrariness. Moral responsibility is something that we need to argue for, we need to present sort of a position about it. And so when we talk about moral responsibility, usually we refer to three criteria. We talk about free will. Can we act in a different way, or were we forced to do what we did, right? Did we have alternatives? Can we choose not to do that? We talk about control. Did we have adequate control to impact the situation? Could we have interfered in time? And we talk about knowledge. Did we know enough about the situation? Did we have all the information that we would need in order to come up with a judgment about that? So we talk about these three criteria when we talk about moral responsibility, and then we need to think of two distinctions. We need to think of negative versus positive, and forward-looking versus backwards-looking. Now, this creates sort of a table that was developed by Sven Nihon, and he sort of talks about these four categories of responsibility. And when we talk about backwards-looking, we're talking about blame, backwards and negative, what happened, and whether you are blameworthy for that. And we're talking about forward-looking negative, something bad is going to happen, you are not doing enough to avoid it, you have an obligation to make sure that that happens. When we talk about backwards and positive, we're thinking about praiseworthy events. You did something great, you won a medal. And forward-looking, we're talking about duties that we have, right? So when it comes to responsibility, there's all these different kinds, but what we're interested in is responsibility gaps, right? Cases in which AI systems create situations in which we do not know whether someone should be held accountable. And the first scenario we looked at was a bombing by a lethal autonomous weapon drone, and it is bombing a target. I think it was, what was the target they were bombing?
Surrendering soldiers.
Right, surrendering soldiers. And it decided to bomb them, and it gave certain, there was no confusion, there was no error. The machine decided to do that. And here are some reasons that it might have used, right? Maybe it was wanting to strike fear into the hearts of onlooking combatants, perhaps to test its weapon systems, because the robot was seeking to revenge the death of robot comrades, right? It might have its own reasons why to do it, but now our question is, had a human being committed the act, they would immediately be charged with a war crime. Who is to be blamed by the bombing of those surrendering soldiers? And what did you guys come up with when you were? But yeah, there are different targets for who might be responsible. So you mentioned maybe the developers, maybe the military personnel that were deploying the system, or that developed and sort of designed the system, or that allowed the system to be used. Perhaps we would actually want to blame the system itself, right? The robotic system. And whether or not we can do that, I'll say a few points later. But these are sort of the immediate options that come up. And the question is, does that make any sense? Or can we justifiably say that these targets all met the criteria for responsibility? Now, the claim within the responsibility gap literature is that there is a gap between who had sufficient knowledge and control and whether the system acted. The more autonomous the system is, the wider that gap becomes, where we do not anymore meet those standards of knowledge, control, and free will. And so it becomes somehow inappropriate to hold certain people responsible. At least so the argument goes. Now, another example that I brought was the case of Elaine Herzberg. Now, Elaine Herzberg was the first fatality of an autonomous vehicle, and she was killed by an Uber car I think it was Arizona, Arizona, yeah, exactly. And Rafaela Vazquez was the test driver sitting inside the car. And the question later became, after the death of Elaine Herzberg, who is to blame? Is it the car itself, like we said? Is it maybe Uber, the company that developed it? Is it the lawmakers that gave Uber the rights to drive on the street? Is it Rafaela Vazquez, who sat inside the car and was supposed to supervise what's going on? Is it no one? Some people are arguing there are blameless harms. No one is responsible. It's a tragic event, right? Did you guys come up with an answer to that? Or did you have an intuition? Okay, fair enough, yeah. What happened later, de facto, was that Uber was banned from using its vehicles anymore, and it gave up its autonomous vehicle project at the time and sold out, I think, to Waymo, so Google. But now they've started up their project again in different cities in the US. They settled a monetary settlement that's hidden with Herzberg's family. So they paid something and settled and never went to trial. So it was a civil lawsuit. Rafaela went again to trial and pleaded guilty in the end for negligence and was sentenced to 3 years probation for not being diligent enough in supervising the scenario. So that's how the law settled this case. Whether that's a good or bad thing, yes, please. Okay, so responsibility gaps raise a lot of different questions. And then when we think about that same table of 4 responsibility versions, we might think that this makes room for 4 gaps. Let's go through them quickly. So the first type of gap we might think about is like the ones we talked about, right? A scenario that something bad happened and we don't know exactly who to blame for it, right? A lethal autonomous weapon drone bombed a building and the operator didn't exactly confirm the attack. The designer had failed. We don't know. Where's the chain of accountability there? Air Canada recently used a chatbot to engage with its customers, and the chatbot promised some kind of reduced fare for one of its passengers for flying to a funeral, I think it was. And then when it was a complete fabrication, there was no sort of reduced price, and the customer sort of demanded being repaid. The company said, no, that was the chatbot's mistake, right? We are not accountable for what the chatbot promised you. And the courts ruled against Air Canada and forced the settlement that they had to pay. But again, we're seeing backwards responsibility gaps. And when we think about positive forward ones, this is an image from the Colorado State Fair. This won the first prize in the digital arts creations by Jason Allen. Later, after winning the first prize, it was discovered that he used Midjourney in order to develop this beautiful image. And so the question is, who is to be praised for creating this wonderful image? Is it the Midjourney, the system? Yes, please. And it's not a painting, it's a digital art. So it was created with AI. I don't know exactly to what extent it was used, but they claimed later that he had cheated and so they didn't like it. Here's another example. This is called The Electrician. It won Sony's World Photography Award, and later was discovered also that this was image generated completely. It's not a photograph, right? This was created by an AI system, and the artist, Boris, said, I'm not a photographer, I'm a promptography, right? I'm promptographer, it's a new form of art. Okay, again, positive responsibility gaps. Who is to say that, is it the system that we should praise? Is it not? And then we have these 2 other ones. I'm going to skip them so that we have time to look at the final topic, but these also raise questions. Who is responsible for making sure that AI systems do not cause harm in the future? Is it Facebook that should make sure that girls don't become bulimic? Can we blame them for that kind of action? This has statistically been shown that social media lead to eating disorders, right? Who is to be accountable for that? And who is in charge of making sure that we align AI systems? Who holds that kind of obligation or duty towards the future? These types of gaps are a huge reason why we often say these systems cannot be developed and used for life or death situations, right? But are these decisive? Is a responsibility gap necessarily a bad thing? Next week, we're going to talk about cases where it's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe there's a good side to it. Can a machine be held responsible? You said that no, but some people are arguing that definitely yes. A machine can be shut down. A machine can maybe be penalized by removing some of its code. A machine can maybe be erased, right? A machine might be sent to machine prison by locking it up. I don't know. We can think of creative ways. And some have argued that this is a thing we can do. Yes, absolutely right. Yeah, this is the question of, are we anthropomorphizing these systems? On the other hand, do these systems meet the conditions for moral responsibility? Do they have belief desire systems? We oftentimes say, yes, they do. A chess-playing bot wants to win the game, and it takes actions to win that game. That's a belief desire mechanism that leads to action. Did it have knowledge? Yes, it definitely had knowledge. It had a lot of knowledge as to the situation. And if it was trained properly, did it know that this was morally reprehensible? Perhaps yes. Now, once it meets all these conditions, now we have a dilemma on our hands, right? So that's the type of argument that people are bringing out. You're absolutely right that the stake is less blameworthy than an intelligent agent, right? And oftentimes when we engage with these types of systems, we intuitively anthropomorphize, right? It's sort of our go-to move. Oh, this chatbot was mean to me, right? Oh, I hate that the iRobot that cleaned around and hit me today, right? So we give them these intentionalities often. Yes? Okay, we have a few minutes. Let's dive into heartless killing and dehumanizing. Unfortunately, this is a really heavy topic and we only have about a few minutes for it. So I'm going to skip this whole part. What I wanted to show you guys is this transition from military engagements that are hand-to-hand and close-up, and how we have slowly moved away from that gradually over time, right? And now finally, we are arriving at the new generation. And the question often is, what is the difference between each one of these developments, and whether each one of these developments raises sort of the same type of problem? Yeah, sorry about that. Now I'm not in here. Okay, and then again in the cavalry, we have the same thing, right? Moving from close-up engagements to very different ones. And in artillery, we have the exact same procedure, right? So we go again. We sort of distance ourselves on and on and on. And then the question is, from a consequentialist standpoint, the strongest argument, and I mentioned this at the beginning, is that less of our soldiers will die. Less of the good guys will get hurt. That's the argument, and it's difficult to find an objection to that because it's very intuitive and it has a lot of strength, right? If we are fighting a just war, we have an obligation to protect our soldiers. So we would need to find non-consequentialist objections if we want to say there's something inherently problematic with the use of these types of systems. Let's hear one example from what you guys discussed. Wait, do I have any of the scenarios here? Let me just, yeah. So the scenario was this. We have a racist soldier who hates a specific minority group, and by coincidence, we are now fighting the country of that minority group, and this racist soldier enlists into the army. He follows all the rules of engagement. He doesn't do anything against the law, and yet he kills out of this motivation to fulfill these racist ideas that he wants to exterminate this ethnic group. Now the question is, what is wrong with this type of situation? And what did you guys come up with? What did you think? Yes. So the issue of intent sometimes plays a role here. And that's a significant question, because if we say there is a right intent to have, even in the most horrific situations like war, it's quite a big thing to say. There's a good way to kill and a bad way to kill. That's sort of the implications of that. And it's not so easy to maintain that idea. So we should be killing only for good reasons, or we shouldn't be killing for bad reasons at least. That's the basic that the story sort of tells us. And from there we look at a parallel story where instead of a racist soldier, now we have a sociopathic soldier, right? He kills everyone because of no reason whatsoever. He just does what his commander tells him. He loves the act of killing in and of itself, perhaps. He's just motivated to follow rules. That's his reason. He has no real legitimate underlying intent behind his actions. And we say, well, what's the problem with this case? And the idea was to bring out this intuition that it's not only that we have an obligation not to act for the wrong reasons, we oftentimes have a duty to act for the right ones, right? And that's sort of the intuition that this types of scenario is supposed to lead us to, right? do we need to act only for the right kinds of reasons? And then when we think of lethal autonomous weapon systems, we say, well, if this is a system that cannot act at all for reasons, because it doesn't have those human capacities, then we've created a system that is doing inherently something bad, something morally wrong. And then there's sort of a list of reasons as to why we want these people to act for the right kinds of reasons, right? Okay, but we've run out of time, unfortunately. We went through this quite quickly, so I think we're going to have to next time cut down on the material, just so we have more chance to talk, because I felt that it went too quickly this time. Good, so that means less preparation for me also. That's nice. Thank you all, and we'll see you all next week.